And so we can go ahead and start with our first author. Our first author is Nancy Shipley. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute Nancy. Okay. Writing her book was prompted by the fact that Nancy could not find a book for her grandson about a boy learning he was going to be a big brother to twin sisters. About that same time, he had a habit of saying, "What?" about everything he found interesting. So of course, Nancy enjoyed incorporating that mannerism into her story. So Nancy, if you would go ahead and share with us, welcome, and thank you for being here tonight.
Well, thank you for having me. You know, I feel like writing a children's book that I should have a resume with all this background experience with children. But actually, my career was started out at Wheaton North High School, and I retired at Vernon Hills High School. I eventually went into administration. So raising two daughters and then having my grandson learn this earth-shattering news that he was going to have twin sisters, I could not find a book to order for him. So I decided I would write one, not knowing the first thing about how to do it or to find an artist. But actually, you know, if you have an idea, go for it, because it's amazing how it'll pan out. And the artist that I found to do my illustrations actually graduated from Vernon Hills High School, where I retired, and she went to the Rhode Island School of Design. So I found out that that's the Harvard for art students. So I felt fortunate that we could collaborate together on this book. So here is the book. Twin Sisters for Jackson. What? Because I was trying to think of what he was probably thinking when he was going through all these sex reveal introductions of what he was thinking. I have to say that Jackson's father is a police officer, so he is very much into police officers and the bad guys and the good guys. So you'll see that theme throughout this story. So I will start to read the story to you. Jackson likes to be a superhero when he is not putting bad guys in jail. He has many favorites, but likes the ones with capes. Jackson is 3 years old and likes to say, "What?" when he is surprised or confused. "Come on, guys, we got to get the bad guys." Off he goes, running through the house with his cape flying in the air. Jackson's parents have told him that Mommy is going to have a baby. What does that mean? Mommy doesn't look different, and he wonders when this baby is coming. After a while, Mommy's stomach starts to get bigger. On Thanksgiving Day, Jackson, along with his Mommy and Daddy, drive to Grandma and Papa Bill's house for dinner. Jackson notices the cake that Daddy is carrying to the car. "What is that?" he asks his Mommy. "It is a special cake because when we cut it today, we will know if you're going to have a brother or sister." What? Jackson is just thinking that he wants to put his finger on the frosting. Yum. After dinner, Mommy and Daddy cut the cake and see the pink filling. A sister for Jackson. All the grown-ups are happy and smiling. Jackson doesn't know what to think except that he wants a piece of that cake. Jackson wants to play, but Daddy says he has to go out to the car because he forgot Grandma's platter. Daddy comes back in behind Grandma and Papa Bill with another cake. Jackson is really wondering now why there are two cakes. No one brings two cakes. What? He brought another dessert. Daddy says Grandma's eyes get as big as Jackson's soccer ball when she sees what the cake states. And the cake says, "Double the trouble and twice the fun. We are having two, not one." Grandma and Papa Bill cut the cake and it has pink filling too. Another girl. Mommy and Daddy have been keeping a secret that they are having twins. Everyone is so happy and smiling and laughing and hugging. But Jackson just wants to play superheroes. Come on, guys, let's get the bad guys. It is almost Christmas and Jackson is traveling on a plane to Florida to visit his other grandparents, Papa and Gigi. Mommy and Daddy have a surprise for them. Jackson likes going to the airport. He especially likes the moving sidewalk. Jackson is thrilled to take his dinosaur suitcase. He packs a soft dog, blanket, and bathing suit to play in the water. Gigi and Papa are so happy to see Jackson. Christmas Day comes and Jackson is so excited to see if Santa finds him in Florida. He isn't worried because Santa always knows where the children are. Jackson wakes up and comes into the living room. So many presents have his name on the packages. What? Santa did find him. Gigi opens a Christmas gift and it has two onesies in it. They have something written on them, but Jackson can't read what they say. Gigi just seems very happy. Girl 1 and Girl 2. Papa gets 2 golf balls and is told to come outside and hit them. Papa hits the golf balls each time pink dust goes into the air. Jackson is starting to understand. He is going to have 2 sisters. Are they coming tonight? He asks his mommy. No, honey, they have to grow inside me for a few more months so they will be healthy. Jackson says to himself, what? After a fun visit in Florida, Jackson helps pack his dinosaur suitcase because they need to fly home and get back to their routine. Jackson misses that his mommy can't pick him up, but Daddy does. Mommy's belly is growing and Jackson tries to be careful not to bump into her. Jackson has been getting things Mommy needs and putting on his own clothes and shoes to help her. He feels good about being able to help. He knows he will be a good big brother. Today, Jackson gets to pack his suitcase for Grandma's. Mommy says he gets to have 2 sleepovers while she is in the hospital. His sisters are coming. What? Jackson is excited about being Papa Bill because he lets him make forts and he lets him put him in jail. He also plays superheroes. Jackson wears his police uniform and Papa Bill plays the bad guy. Come on, guys, let's get the bad guys. Grandma asks Jackson, what will it be like to have 2 sisters? Jackson thinks for a minute and then he asks, will they run as fast as me when they eat blueberries? Grandma hugs him and tells him, yes, absolutely. They will be able to run fast, but not at first because they will be tiny babies like you were when you were born. What? Jackson thinks and he smiles. They can't eat blueberries when they are babies. Grandma takes Jackson to the hospital to see Mommy, Daddy, and his new sisters. They are so tiny. Jackson gets to touch them and he gives them a kiss. He loves them so much already. In a few years, his sisters will be playing superheroes and making forts with him. He won't be by himself. He can teach them how to play hide and seek and how to run fast, especially after they eat blueberries. Maybe they can be the superheroes and Jackson will be the bad guy. That will be so much fun. How crazy is that? What? The end. And here's a picture of all of us right after the twins were born. You can see that's little Jackson in real life. So that was my little project. I was just thinking that maybe there are other parents out there that were having had a son and having twin sisters with so much infertility and fertility clinics. My daughter went through fertility to have the twins. So I thought maybe someone else would be looking for that same story.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Nancy. Again, for our participants, please make sure that your chat window is open. We'd love to hear from you. Any questions that you might have for Nancy? So we'll pause just for a second. I know, Nancy, working in the children's department of library, I know that it was always really a challenge to write concisely and not go overboard with the language and the descriptions or use words that were above the level of the children that would be reading the story. Did you find that to be kind of a challenge, or?
I was basically thinking how Jackson would think about it, you know, and how he might say something. It's funny because I threw in the blueberry thing, and when I read the story to him, he goes, Grandma, I don't like blueberries. But it was just something I threw in there thinking, okay, well, blueberries are really healthy, and, you know, maybe I should put that in there, you know, so maybe he'll get the idea and maybe want to eat some. So yeah, it basically was just a gift of love for them to have their story written down, that after I'm long gone, you know, I've left something that they would have to keep. I mean, I knew that I would probably never make what I put into the book, but that wasn't just the reason why I did it in the first place. It was just kind of having a project for me to do.
Sure, sure. And we do have a couple questions in the chat. One is, have you, I'm sorry, they're scrolling by quickly. Here we go. How did Jackson receive the news that a book was written for him?
The book actually came in time for Christmas, and I wrapped it up. And it's so interesting because there was a problem with the first printing, And the book that I picked out for him, I didn't go through it page by page, and it was a double print. So I thought, how ironical, this is a book about twins, and there's 2 stories in the same book. So I thought, well, this just has to be his. But I thought about all the poor parents that are tired at night reading a story, and if they get a story the double printed, you get to the end of it and you think, oh my gosh, it's starting over again. So that was just kind of funny. So he, he didn't really know what to think when he, I think his parents thought it was a bigger deal, but then, he got into it and asked for that story later for several nights. And I went to his preschool and read it to his class. Then he thought it was, cool that he had this story.
Nice, nice. And there's another question here. Have you received other responses from children or their parents to your book, maybe when they identified with the situation?
I did. I have had several friends order for their grandchildren. Friends of mine who I knew their kids when they were little, I ordered a copy so that I could autograph it for them to have. I did a Facebook page about the book, and I did hear a response from one mother who said, oh, this is perfect. I have a son named Jackson and I have twin girls. So that was perfect because then it fit, for that family.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. This next question may apply to all of our authors, but we'll let you answer it first since we have time here. It says, did you have to revise your story many times? Who did you have read your story before submitting it to the publisher, and how did you go about getting it published? So I'm sorry, the first part is, how did you have to revise your story many times?
I actually passed it around to friends and had them read through it. And that was good, so they can make some, different changes or maybe, rephrase something. As far as getting it published, I self-published. And it was just someone who I knew. I was on the board of directors for the Chamber of Commerce while I was working, and I met this gentleman who had an insurance agency, and then later he sold the insurance agency and started a publishing company in Libertyville, Illinois, called 111 Publishing. So I contacted him about publishing it, and that's how I got published.
Okay, great. I'm just rereading through this question in the chat to make sure that we got a chance to cover everything. I think so. So I thank you so much, Nancy. I really appreciate that. And
you're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, we're doing silent applause because we're all muted, unfortunately, but thank you so much. I'll go ahead and mute you, and we will introduce our next author. Our next author is Glennette Tilley Turner. Glennette's research and writing started soon after her family moved to Wheaton in 1968, inspired by a neighbor's claim that the Underground Railroad had operated here. Her discoveries led to publishing 5 books on the subject, becoming an advisor to the National Park Service, and being honored by the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom for outstanding work in the field. So we are thrilled to have Glennette with us. Please go ahead, Glennette.
Thank you, Barry. And also hello to all the attendees at the Author Fest. In addition to Underground Railroad books, for which I'm probably best known, I've written a number of biographies, Take a Walk in Their Shoes and Follow in Their Footsteps. Our collective biographies of 24 notable African Americans tells their life stories and their struggles and challenges and what they overcame. In addition, there are skits that accompany each biography, and kids really love them. Lewis Howard Latimer is the story of the man who drew the telephone patent for Alexander Graham Bell. He worked directly with Thomas Edison, and he is the inventor of the incandescent filament for the electric light. And this biography is Billy the Barber's Mirror. It's an untold Abraham Lincoln story. It's the story of Lincoln's Haitian barber, the man who sculpted Abraham Lincoln's signature beard. And then to the Underground Railroad. These are my Underground Railroad titles. This is one that was the very first one, and obviously quite old, but it's called the Underground Railroad in Dupage County. This is a chapter book called Running for Our Lives, and the kids who are in the story start out with their parents but are separated and have to make their way to Canada. And then this is the Underground Railroad in Illinois. It is just filled with pictures and maps, and in addition, there's an entire chapter that's devoted to activities that any age reader can enjoy, either through art, music, language, science, math, just to all the disciplines. It is kind of the way to study the Underground Railroad in an enjoyable way. And then the other Underground Railroad book I wrote really had a different destination. So many of the books on the Underground Railroad tell, or the accounts of the Underground Railroad tell of Canada as the promised land. But this book, Fort Mose, tells about the Underground Railroad in Florida, as does my forthcoming book, which is about a Black Seminole chief in Florida, and it will be rolling off the presses in 2021. And then last but not least is An Apple for Harriet Tubman, obviously the best known of the Underground Railroad conductors. And I learned this story from a great niece of Harriet Tubman's. You know how so many of the stories tell about her, only about her Underground Railroad work. But this tells how Harriet Tubman loved to enjoy apples. The lighting is such, I'm having trouble seeing. If I can just hold this and then hold it up. Harriet was born into slavery in about 1820. Her parents were enslaved, and therefore she was enslaved. She was born on the Brutus Plantation in Maryland. And this is a picture, I'm not quite sure how to get it on the screen, or if it's showing on the screen, of her family. And children were were forced to do labor as were adults. And Harriet, of course, was one of the children who did that work. But when Harriet was only 7, Edward Brodus sent her to work for an unkind woman named Miss Susan. One of Harriet's jobs was to sit up all night taking care of Miss Susan's baby so that her crying would not wake her mother. If the baby did cry, Miss Susan would whip Harriet. I hope these pictures will show up on the screen, do they? Okay. Later on, Harriet worked in the fields. She liked working outdoors where she could feel the fresh breezes, see the sunshine, and watch birds in the trees. Picking apples was her favorite outdoor job. Whenever she held a shiny red apple in her hand, she wished, oh, how she wished she could take a bite out of it. She longed to know what it tasted like and to know if it was as good as it looked. She didn't like the fact that she and other slaves were expected to pick, wash, polish these apples, but never to eat them. She didn't think that was fair, but slaves did all the work and the family in the big house got to eat the apples. And these are good pictures. That's my favorite picture in the book. Each day, as Harriet picked and polished apples, she looked for the chance to crunch into one. One day, when the overseer was walking down to the other end of the orchard, she thought, this is my chance. But just as she was biting deep into a delicious apple, the overseer whirled around and caught her. Angrily, he took his whip and lashed Harriet The whip tore through her clothing and into her flesh. It left scars that lasted the rest of her life. She couldn't fight back or do anything about it then, but she made herself a promise. One day I'm going to be free and I'm going to have all the apples I want. Years passed and Harriet married a free man by the name of John Tubman. In 1849, she learned that she might be sold and sent away from her husband, sisters, and brothers. Harriet took action. She ran away from the Brodus plantation. She walked until she reached a safe house, a place where she knew members of the Underground Railroad would help her. The Underground Railroad was not a railroad, but a group of black and white men and women who took great risks to help people escape from slavery. Then, through dense forests and chilly swamps, she followed the North Star toward the north and freedom. She was always on the lookout for slaveholders and for their bloodhound dogs. Later, Harriet was hidden in a farm wagon and taken to another safe house. Finally, she reached the Delaware Bay in the state of Delaware. A boatman helped her cross to the New Jersey shore. From there, she made her way to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Here in the north, she was free, just as she promised herself that she would be. I neglected to show the picture from escape. And this is the picture of where she made her way to the Delaware shore. But Harriet was not happy in freedom while her family was still enslaved. She went to work as a maid and a cook. She saved her money and went back again and again to Maryland to free her family and lead many other people out of slavery. It was extremely dangerous for Harriet to do this. There was a huge reward for her capture. The slaveholders were very angry that she had become an Underground Railroad conductor, guiding other slaves to freedom. But she and her passengers were never caught. In 1869, Harriet bought a house near Auburn, New York. She planted rows of apple trees along the lane that led from the road to her home. It had taken a long time, but she was finally able to keep the second part of the promise she had made to herself. Each fall, when the apples were ripe and ready for picking, Harriet Tubman had all the apples she could eat, and she invited the townspeople to come and fill their baskets. Harriet Tubman's apples were a symbol of freedom for everyone to share. And then in the author's note, it says Harriet Tubman was the greatest conductor on the Underground Railroad. She made many trips to southern states to free hundreds of enslaved Africans. She was called Moses because she led her people out of bondage. When Harriet was born, her parents named her Armanita and called her Minty. She had later changed her name to Harriet. She was a Union nurse and a scout during the Civil War. And just one day in June of 1863, she led a raid that freed 700 enslaved people. Many books tell these facts and describe Harriet Tubman's heroism, but very few know about her love of apples. I learned of it during an interview in 1984 with her great niece, Mrs. Alice Brickler, who had learned of it from Harriet Tubman herself. This story gives us an insight into the life of what a remarkable heroine Harriet Tubman was. Harriet Tubman used to tell children, learn, learn all you can. No one can take away what you have in your head. If you'd like to find out more about her and about the Underground Railroad, you will enjoy many of the other books on the subject in the Wheaton Library. And also, you will be receiving these ideas for activities you can do as a follow-up of reading the book on the apple for Harriet Tubman. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Glennette. We have just a couple of questions and comments here in the chat, so let me go ahead and read these for you. There was a question about providing a list of all of those wonderful things that you showed at the beginning, and I just want to let everyone know that we will be sending out links in a follow-up email after this program, so you will be able to find access to all of those things. The next question, Glennette, is who is your publisher? Or maybe there might be more than one.
There are different publishers. The Apple for Harriet Tubman was published by Albert Whitman in Chicago. Fort Mose and the new book that I'm writing, it was published by Abrams Books in New York. This was Penguin, Take a Walk in Their Shoes, as was Follow in Their Footsteps. And then there was a publisher called Ginn and Company that published the Lewis Howard Latimer as part of their Pioneers in Change series. And I self-published this. I have a company called Nieman Educational Publishing Company. And this and the Underground Railroad in Illinois and this edition of Running for Our Lives were published by my publishing company. Originally, Holiday House published this in the hardcover, but then they never put it in softcover, and I asked for the rights back and published it myself.
Great, thank you. And so a wide assortment, yeah.
And then comes.
Yeah, so that's great. Thank you. Good information. Just a couple people mentioned how much they love the beautiful artwork behind you. I don't know if you want to say a tiny bit about what that is behind you.
Well, my husband and I treated ourselves to a trip to Paris for our 50th anniversary. And this was the one thing that we bought for ourselves and thought that that would be a very appropriate wall hanging, and have enjoyed it very much.
And now we get to enjoy it too. It's gorgeous. Thank you very much. Let me just read the next comment that's in the chat. He says, a nice surprise to see you are the author of one of my daughter's favorite books before she became a tween. She calls herself a multi-culti. You have made an impact on her through your book. My question, will you write more books like this about other well-known or less known heroes? Just maybe what your plans are.
Yes, I love to write untold stories. I just find them fascinating, and sometimes I learn of them quite by coincidence. For example, the story about Lincoln's barber was told to me, or I learned of the barber through my mother, who had known a descendant of the barbers, and the descendant who inherited a very lovely mirror that had hung in the barber shop, and of course the mirror in which Abraham Lincoln saw his reflection. Did that answer your question?
I believe so. Just kind of you've written about lots of very well-known people, but also it's so intriguing to find those stories about lesser known heroes and really interesting things.
It's interesting to learn details of lives of well-known people, details.
Yes, exactly. We have another comment here from the chat. The illustrations in your books are beautiful, and a question about what kinds of questions do you receive from children when you're sharing these books? What kinds of things are they asking?
They often ask, how much do you make? And of course, it's usually the answer is very little, but many are interested in writing and are inspired by authors to write their own stories. I had participated in Authors in the Schools in Chicago for many years, was one of the charter members of that, and it was just wonderful to speak to children and then do writing prompts to encourage them to do their own stories.
Great. Great, thank you. Just another comment about what a beautiful story. It is the one that you read. And the last comment we have here is from Rebecca. She says, I'm so proud of all your great writing of outstanding and sometimes little known African Americans. Great work. Yeah, just lots of kudos and great thoughts for all of the wonderful things that you've done. And just looking to see if there are any more questions. Just a comment about what a wonderful story it is that all children should read, and just a question about if you know if your books are in some of the local schools.
They aren't in as many as I would wish. I have been really kind of disappointed that some of the Illinois schools have not taken the opportunity to acquaint children with the history that happened here. I think it gives such a sense of place to know of history that happened along the Dupage River or the Fox or, the highways that we travel. But they are in many of the schools, and I've conducted workshops and spoken with kids. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And we will have time for more questions at the end, but let's go ahead and move on to our last final author for tonight, Jarmila Del Boccio. Yarm finds her inspiration in everyday life, but in particular when she travels the globe, observing quirky things that happen along the way. Focusing on the lives of characters from the past, Yarm is devoted to breathing life into the pages of history and offers her young readers hope, heart, and a real-life hero. So thank you for being with us here tonight, Yarm. You are unmuted, and you are ready to take the floor. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. It's just a pleasure to be here. I'm a former teacher and school librarian, so I am really thrilled to be here and to share my story. I'm a debut author, and it's my first story, unlike Glennette, who is prolific, which is fabulous. I think that is so great. But I have one story. I have 2 or 3 others I'm submitting to agents and editors, but my passion, as I mentioned, is to breathe new life into history, to find those little stories, just like Glennette, actually, she mentioned this, to find little known facts about people in history and to kind of relive their childhood, because most of the time you know about adults, but you don't know how they were when they were children, or finding kids in history that did big things that most people don't know about. They're even little things, but they make a huge impact on people. So it was the same with my story, The Heart Changer. Can you see it? Sorry, you know what? I should probably change anyway, I'll worry about that later. But The Heart Changer, and this is a story from 9th century BC. I'm gonna go ahead and take that out, sorry. Take that out, and so that I can actually, there you go. Okay, sorry. So you can see it now. It might be backwards, but anyway, The Heart Changer. So this is a story from 9th century BC from the Old Testament, 2 Kings. I'm sure many of you have heard the story of Nieman's servant girl. She is mentioned in 2 Kings in the Old Testament, but we really know nothing about her. She has no name, no backstory, and very little is mentioned about her. We know a little bit about the history, and I just wanted to bring her story to life. There are 2 or 3 other such stories or children in scripture that have made a huge impact in people's lives, but we know nothing about them. So I kind of bring her story to life. I call her Miriam. Miriam is an Israelite girl and who is in the northern part of Israel. And of course, back in those days, they were invaded by a number of enemies. And at one point, the Syrians came, and Nieman was the commander of the Syrian army. And he basically, in my story, pillaged her village and took her captive. And so I wanted kids to kind of relive the story and to know what it would have been like to be Miriam and how she would have felt. Of course, she would have had angst. She would have been angry. She would have been worried. She was taken away from her home and family in a crisis. And how would you respond? How did she respond? And so that's what I share about how she struggles with what has happened with her God, with her faith, with all that's coming around her, and how she responds. So I'm going to read the first page for you, and then I have an activity that I usually ask kids after I finish this, and I'll ask you, and then I have a couple of other comments. So, and you can hear me well? Okay. All right. Actually, I'm going to put on my glasses so I can see. So this is chapter 1. Run, run, my daughter. Don't let them see you. Miriam's mother cried in alarm, shielding baby Zacchaeus in her long robes. She watched, helpless, as her precious child ran to escape the oncoming invasion. Picking up her skirts, the young girl fled down the center of Shunem Town Market, following the frantic path of others, terror-stricken by the billowing clouds of dust gathering in the distance. As the villagers ran for their lives, baskets of fruits and vegetables, nuts and spices were carelessly scattered on the parched ground. Carts of fish and goat's cheese were upset. The sound of splintering and cracking added to the mayhem as striped awnings ripped from their door frames. Goats and sheep scattered, and those who could not be freed from their leads bleated in fear. Shouts of the Syrian army and the sound of clomping horses' hooves on the stone pavement signaled the enemy's advance. Cries and screams escaped from the villagers as they dropped a trail of precious belongings in their flight. A keepsake and a fresh loaf of bread meant nothing. Only their lives mattered now. And that's what I'll read. And I ask everyone, the kids, and I put it on a bookmark that I give with the book. You are forced from your home and have 5 minutes to pack. What will you bring? And I mean, this is for adults and kids, but it really shows what's important in your life, and what is the most important thing. And the first thing you'll think of, let's say you give them a choice of 3 things, and it gets them thinking, it gets them talking. Maybe they can write a little story about some situation that happens where they're put in that situation and they have to leave, and what they would take. And so it's kind of a story starter, I guess you would say. I have a number of other scenes in here that could be used for story starters. And I also put together the Heart Changer. It's a teacher's guide, and it's on my website under resources. And it talks about not only me as an author, but about Miriam, the main character, and asking some questions about how she might feel and maybe about her surroundings, or some cultural questions, geography questions, some activities that kids can involve themselves in. And you can download and print it to go along with that. I've also put together it's a video on YouTube, and I can give you, Barry, the link. Also another link, if you sign up on my onto my newsletter, then I will give you a reluctant reading, not reluctant reading, it's a story spark. It's kind of when you have kids who really want to start writing, how do they do it? They have all this energy, they love to write. How can you spark them to write further? So I've got a little 3 or 4 page PDF for that, so I can give you that information as well. But but anyway, this YouTube video I put together just 2 or 3 months ago, especially when this COVID thing happened, to give kids a way of sparking them to write again. This is called Fractured Fairy Tales, and I do a little reading, the same reading I just did. I asked them the question, and then we go on to talking about fairy tales, and about I zero in on 3 or 4 different fairy tales, and how you could fracture them or mix them up and take the characters from one, the setting from another, and maybe the situation from the third, and make a whole nother story. And that's a real popular thing today. So that's another idea. So I have a number of ways of getting kids interested in reading. And I do love those little kids history and scripture who have made a huge impact. And I do want kids to realize that they can be the heroes of their own story, that they can step up to the plate and make a huge difference. It wasn't until this girl was unjustly treated. She was taken to her home. Now we don't know exactly how she was treated, but we do know she was taken from her home, and she responded at first with bitterness, but her heart changed. And because of that, she made a huge impact on her captor, on Nieman, and in his life. And I won't, if you don't know the story, I won't continue on so that that I won't spoil the story for you. But that's it. So if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them.
Great, Nancy. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, so go ahead and make sure that your chat window is open. You can put any of your questions in there. You know, it was a great beginning to the story there. It reminded me a little bit of some of the refugees that I've worked with over the years, and similarities to their story, and how I can imagine that the children would find commonalities there. So even so many centuries apart, really interesting. We do have a question here. How long did it take you to get the book from its start to its publication?
Okay, well, this is actually one book that it's hard for me to remember, but I would say I probably started it about 7 or 8 years ago. I'd actually written another story about the little boy who fed his lunch, or gave his lunch to Jesus. And a similar situation where he has no backstory, you don't know his name, but I gave him a backstory and a whole story with it. And I thought, well, it's time to write one about a girl. And so I thought this was going to be a chapter book. And I thought, no, this really needs to be a middle grade novel. So I had to enlarge it or make it longer. And so I would say I probably started it 7 years ago. I put it away for 2 years, and then 3 or 4 years later, I picked it up and started adding scenes and words and different things to it, and expanded it to about, I believe it's about 25 or 30,000 words. And it was at that point, after my critique group had gone over it, I had a number of people go through it, that I was on Faith Pitch on Twitter, and it was snatched up by Ambassador International. And then, of course, when they got a hold of it and decided to publish it, it went through 3 rounds of editing, which took about, I'd say, 3 or 4 months. I think I started in April or May of 2018, and we were finished about September. And then we chose a cover, worked on a cover, and then it was published last year in April. So I'm just past the first birthday of my book.
Great. Okay, great. Thank you. And just a clarification, I think you said it was for middle grades, but what age range would you say that the book is written for?
And I would say probably 8 to 12. Now my adult friends, read it and they love it, but I would say it's geared more towards 8 to 12-year-olds. Certainly the more mature 8-year-olds that know how to read. I would say probably a sweet spot is maybe 9, 10, 11 years of age. Yeah, so that would probably be appropriate.
Great, thank you. And another question, how did you start writing? Had you been writing had you been longing to write for some time?
Well, the funny thing is, growing up, I mean, I wrote diaries all my life. And I think things started out that way. I just recently found my favorite book as a kid. It's called Do You Know? A Bible Guessing Game. I don't even think it's published these days, or it's even anywhere. But when I opened it up, I laughed, because this is when I realized that I wanted to be, way back then, I wanted to be, if you can see what I did, I drew all over it. I guess I liked the story, but I thought I could do a better job. So I started writing over my book. And I tell the kids when I show them, I said, please don't do that to your book. It's a bad example, but that's what I did. Anyway, but I would write in diaries. I wrote little plays for my church and that kind of thing. But it wasn't until my mother died. She was just short of her 100th birthday. And I started panicking because all her sisters and brothers, I was the only child. My father had died when I was 4. And I thought, oh no, I'm never going to remember all those stories of my childhood. We traveled all over the United States. And I thought I better start writing these down, just after she died, so I have a very bad memory. And so I thought I was going to be writing memoirs. And then I got into a contest for writing picture books, and it was a good segue because I was a kindergarten teacher and I love kids. But then I was just writing too long. I wanted to explain things too much in a picture book, and an author friend said, why don't you write middle grade? Because then you can use a lot more words. And so that was my sweet spot. I found it middle grade. So
That's great. Thank you. I will invite our participants to go ahead and we're going to ask one more question here of Yarm, and then we're going to open it up to questions for everyone. So if you want to go ahead and put your questions in the chat, just please we'll put who the question is for, if it's for one of our authors specifically, at the beginning of the question so we can address it appropriately. Again, Yarm will ask this one more question for you, and then we'll open up all three mics. The question is, who served in your critique group, and also did you have any input from children?
Not before it was published. My critique group was, well, I had actually two critique groups. One was one woman who would come, and the two of us would critique each other's works. And then the second critique group was a group, it was word weavers, and we're online once a month, and they went through my story. But I think it wasn't vetted beforehand with kids. But one thing as an author, if you have to read a lot of the kind of books that you're going to write, and those that have been published already, and so that's kind of that's the advice that we're given. So the more you read in the genre, the more you'll know how to write in the genre. And I think the publishers generally are pretty good at choosing books that they know kids will, because they publish them and they know what's popular. So yes, so that it was vetted that way. But afterwards, kids read it, and I have some really heartrending and touching reviews, I guess, from the kids, all the way down to 8 years of age, up to 16 years old, and so that's precious to me.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, and of course, thank you to all of our authors. If you want to go ahead and unmute your microphones. Glennette, if you want to unmute yourself, and I think you're set to go, Nancy. And again, to our participants, if there's anything else that you would like to ask, go ahead and put your questions in the chat. If it's to a particular author, if you would put their name at the beginning of your question, that way we can make sure that it gets to the right person. So we'll wait just for a minute about that.
While you're waiting, I wanted to say that all of us are obviously teachers, and I've always realized that you may retire, but you never recover from your desire to share knowledge and inspire people.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Glennette, we do have a question for you here. It says, how do you choose the people or events for your books?
Really, a number of people are people that I've been fascinated by all my life. My father told me the story of Garrett A. Morgan and how he had invented the stoplight. My father was really intrigued with invention and inventors. And one time we were at a little town that was so small it really didn't need a stoplight, but of course waited. And he told me that story. And then he added, when you grow up, you should write this down, because books at that time did not include the stories of African Americans. And so that was example of Garrett Morgan. But other people who whom I've been interested in, I've wanted to know more about and wanted to share their stories.
Great, great, thank you. Yeah, any other questions that we have for our illustrious authors here tonight? We'll wait just another minute for people to put those in. Again, remember that we have several more of these wonderful events coming up. Another one in 2 weeks, and then again the 2nd and 4th Thursdays in July. So we'd be.
If I may interject, I think keeping a journal is so important, and I really encourage everyone to do that. I think so much happens in your life, and just for example, during this period of the pandemic, just to record the nuances of your experiences and your feelings would have been just so important, and going forward they can, or to interview elderly relatives to get their stories and their shared experiences, and especially since this COVID-19 is killing older people, talk to them quick.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And at the library, we also have an initiative to be submitting those stories. So again, obviously a great idea to be writing those stories, especially at this really difficult and unprecedented time. How many times have we heard that phrase? But we have a place to submit those so that we can start to compile them, and the Dupage County Historical Society has expressed interest in those stories as well. Yarm, we have another question for you. What inspired you to write about the topics in your book?
Well, I'm sorry, did you say?
Yarm, yes.
Okay. As I mentioned, I like to find the little kids in history or scripture that have made a huge impact, but we know very little about. And so I like to embellish and imagine their story and relate it to kids so that they can, sometimes I think they think people in history were so different from them, especially as children. And I think if they realize how alike they are, how much they resemble these kids. These kids had the same feelings, the same hopes, the same dreams, maybe in a little different way, of course, because it's a different century, but that they can be inspired by them. If those children back in history could do those things, then I can do it as well and make a huge impact on people around me. So what I think the way I've found them many times, I home educated our kids, and we would read a lot of these historic events and from these books, and all of a sudden this name would pop up, or this situation would pop up, or this historical, and wow, I didn't know that. Fascinating. And so I'd write it down and keep a list of things, and that's basically how I've done that, especially with the one book in particular that I finished writing about the vaccine, the smallpox vaccine that went back to America. And I wrote a story about that, about the orphans. It was taken with 22 orphans. The vaccine was they were immunized one at a time, and it would take them across the ocean until they actually got to the Americas, so they could immunize those kids or the people, and then stop the smallpox in America. So it's just fascinating, these fascinating parts of history. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. There is another question here about availability of your books on Amazon or other booksellers. And I think we said that in our follow-up email, we will be providing links from each of the authors as to how to access those materials. So that should answer that question. Courtney was good enough to put the link for the quarantine stories. So if you have, as taking Glennette's suggestion, if you're journaling and writing about the quarantine and your experience, we welcome you to submit those. That link is in the chat. And of course on the library's website as well. Here's another question for our authors. Do the authors also illustrate their books, or is there a certain manner to submit? There's two very different questions. Do you also illustrate your books? And then the other question is there a certain manner to submit your work to the publisher? And Yarm, I don't know if you want to go first, and we can get to each of our authors.
Well, I don't illustrate my books, even though my father was an artist. And of course, a middle grade novel doesn't need to be. But generally, publishers want to choose their illustrators
was done by a friend of mine in Elgin, and she is an artist and really has done the artwork. But I've just been delighted. But as was said before, usually publishers, unless you're publishing something yourself, as I did in this case, really like to select their own artists.
Right, right. Thank you. And another question for you, Nancy. Someone was wondering, has your grandson expressed any interest in writing a book with you? Is he a budding writer himself?
That's really interesting. I think right now, if he was to write a book, he would be writing about how annoying having 1-year-old twin sisters are, because he gets kind of jealous of, having mommy and daddy's time spent, other places. I have had friends tell me my other grandchildren live in Sweden, and they've asked me if I'm ever going to write a book about them. So I was like, well, I don't know. Probably not, but so it's a good question.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. A question for you, Glennette. It says, how can individuals be allies during this time?
Oh, could the person clarify their question?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. Yeah, maybe Laura, if you could explain a little bit more what you're asking, and we'll get back to that. Another individual, and I'm not sure who this is for, but it says, I have a few very small pieces published here and there in various venues. Of people of color in children's books. Let me go back to the start of that question. How can individuals be allies during this time, Glennette, especially representing the importance of representing people of color in children's books? How can we support that, perhaps?
I think to read the stories, I think there's so much linkage in all of our lives that the more we read, the more we will realize the common denominators and the linkages and similarities. There's a friend of mine, Darwin Walton, who wrote a children's book called What Color Are You? And I just really think in these times that it really is a must read because it just tells how every child has the same needs regardless of exterior packaging. I think, that's just an example of how the common denominator of humaneness or humanness is so there.
Absolutely. Yes, yes. And that's a great resource. And the individual is asking any other particular resources that you would recommend?
There are a number of children's books. There's a list that the library has published that I think probably to go to local libraries. There are a number of books that I've read and have been influenced by and impressed with, but I think maybe to check the local library for books and to inquire of other friends which books they have found helpful would be probably the best.
Right. We were even corresponding this morning about there's a particular list in the library's catalog on books pertaining to racial equity and those types of concerns for adults, teens, and children. So let's see, I'm just trying to make sure that we've addressed everything in the chat. Another comment about or question how we can advocate for the schools integrating books like yours, Glennette, in their schools. Would there be certain ways that we could promote that? You said that your books weren't as available in the schools as one would think or you might hope. What could someone from the community do to promote that?
I think to request them, or if PTAs do request them, I think really would that would be very helpful.
Mm-hmm. Right, and I know that some school libraries and public libraries have programs where you can gift a book in honor of someone, and so if budgets are tight, gifting the book in honor of someone would also be a nice idea as well. You communicating with them, absolutely.
I had even thought, if every school had copies, like classroom sets even of the Underground Railroad in Illinois, that really students could really learn more about the local history and have a greater appreciation for
Absolutely, absolutely. Again, I'm just looking through the chat to make sure that we've gotten to every question and comment. Okay, I have, someone says, authors, have you been inspired to write about acts of inhumanity towards people of color with the intention of teaching children about compassion, kindness, equity, and those types of topics?
One of the things that I wrote about was Ida B. Wells. She experienced really horrific things in her family's life. But as a little girl, she knew how to read, but her parents didn't because they'd been denied the opportunity to learn while they were enslaved. And so they would her father would sit her on a tall stool and she'd read aloud the newspaper to him and to his friends. One of those friends was later killed, and that really, really lynched. And then it was such an inspiration to her to do all of the anti-lynching work that she did.
Right, absolutely, yeah. And
there's a skit in the book, about how she's a little girl sitting on the bench and reading.
Right, and we so need to hear those stories, absolutely. All right, well, I know that it is after 8, and we certainly want to thank you so much to our authors for your time, for sharing all of your insights and your work with us. Thank you so much. Thank you to your participants. We're very grateful that you are here with us tonight. Please join us in 2 weeks as we have some additional authors as they share their work and their insights. But I think that that's it for tonight. We have many people saying thank you again to our authors in the chat window. So let me pass those along to you. We certainly appreciate all of your insights and your wonderful work and all that you've been doing in our community. Thank you very much. And
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much,
everyone.
Thanks. Thank you.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Good night.